the session? Perfect. Well, welcome everyone to the webinar today for the January webinar of the joint webinar series topic at the nexus of climate change, fisheries, and blue foods. My name is Laura Anderson. I'm an engagement project manager at the Stanford Center for Ocean Solutions and support the Blue Food Futures program, which is a UN Ocean Decade program. We're really excited to co-host this webinar series with some other Ocean Decade programs, and I want to let my colleagues and co-hosts introduce themselves now before we turn to the topic of today's webinar, shifting species distributions. So I'll start with Claire. Do you want to introduce FishScore?
Sure, thanks, Laura. I'm with the FishScore program. FishScore stands for Fisheries Strategies for Changing Oceans and Resilient Ecosystems by 2030. And the program aims to facilitate an international network of partners to develop information, tools, and resources for supporting climate resilience in fisheries and fishing communities, as well as provide a forum for the exchange of experiences, research, and to develop new collaborations. And FishScore partners will provide scientific and management and community development expertise, as well as policy linkages that will advance the science and practice of supporting climate resilience in marine fisheries. We're excited to be joint hosting this webinar series. Thanks, Laura.
Wonderful. Thanks, Claire. Grace, do you want to go next about Supreme?
Sure, thanks. Hi, everyone. My name is Grace Roskar. I am the coordinator for the Supreme program, which stands for the Sustainability, Predictability, and Resilience of Marine Ecosystems. So with the Supreme program, we're trying to also build an international network, and we're really trying to better understand climate-driven changes in coastal ecosystems and promote best practices in developing modeling infrastructure and forecasts and projections. And the ultimate aim is to help guide effective marine ecosystem management and adaptation strategies. So thanks so much.
Wonderful. Thanks, Grace. And Stephen, do you want to introduce SmartNet?
Sure. Thanks, Laura. SmartNet stands for Sustainability of Marine Ecosystems through Global Knowledge Networks. So we're also a decade program sponsored by ICES and Pisces, which are two leading intergovernmental marine science organizations. And our goal is really to leverage the infrastructure and partnerships and long-term collaborations between ICES and Pisces to build a global network that can share knowledge and also share capacity, mostly around the themes of climate impacts on marine ecosystems and the resilience and sustainability of marine ecosystems and fisheries. Yeah, thanks.
Wonderful. Thanks, Stephen. We're really excited to have two great speakers for this month's webinar on shifting species distributions. I'll introduce both of them now, and then we can turn to Jackie's presentation. So Jackie Vogel is a PhD student with a joint appointment at San Diego State University and University of California, Santa Barbara, who has spent the last few years with the Environmental Defense Fund researching topics related to climate resilient fisheries management and ocean conflict. She will present today on transboundary fish stocks and ocean conflict under climate change, the Arctic, and other case studies. We also have Melissa Karp here today, who is a fish biologist in the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's Office of Science and Technology's National Stock Assessment Program, that's a mouthful, located in NOAA's headquarters office in Silver Spring, Maryland. She will present information about the newly released Distribution, Mapping, and Analysis portal, DISMAP, which is a user-friendly and interactive website designed to provide visualization and analysis tools to better track, understand, and respond to shifting distributions of marine species. So we're really excited for both of the presentations today, and we'll start off with Jackie's presentation. So I'll stop sharing my screen, and Jackie, if you want to share screen, we're excited to hear about your project.
Cool, thanks, Laura. Okay, can you all see the right thing?
Yep.
Okay, so hello, everyone. As Laura mentioned, my name is Jackie Vogel. I want to start by thanking Claire and Laura and Grace and everyone who made this event possible and for inviting me to come speak with you today. So Laura already introduced me. I can skip over all of that. But just want to, first of all, acknowledge the different organizations that I'm representing today and mention that I am currently with San Diego State and UC Santa Barbara, but I will mostly be presenting on some work that I did with the Environmental Defense Fund and partially funded by the World Wildlife Fund. So you see them represented here. Okay, so here's a quick overview of what I'll cover today. This talk is roughly broken into 3 parts, each of which is a discrete project that I've been working on related to transboundary stocks and fisheries conflict. So they definitely all build off of each other and they're very interrelated. So I'll kind of be telling this like a narrative of the sequential order in which these projects have progressed over the last 2.5 years. And I'll get into some of the really interesting outcomes that we've produced along the way. So starting on the left here, this first project focuses on a manuscript published in Marine Policy last summer, focused on drivers of conflict and resilience in shifting transboundary fisheries. Then I'll transition to talking about Oceans Futures, which is a data-driven predictive platform spearheaded by Sarah Glauser at the World Wildlife Fund. And this project is highly interrelated to the first project that I'll talk about, and it's an ongoing partnership between WWF, EDF, University of British Columbia, and many other partners. And finally, I'll spend just a few minutes talking about the Arctic, both as a component of the Oceans Futures project, but also as a continuing focus of my own dissertation work on ocean conflict and climate impacted fisheries. At the top, I just want to acknowledge the many people who have contributed to the stages of this work. So without all of the people listed here and many others, none of this would have been possible. So I just want to thank them and acknowledge their contributions at the top. Okay, so starting with the first phase of this work, which focuses on transboundary stocks and fisheries conflict. So this project was initially conceived when I first started at EDF in 2021. And I was tasked with this pretty specific research question, which is, how are climate-induced stock shifts going to negatively impact those who manage, catch, consume, or otherwise rely on these shifting marine resources? I know that is quite a mouthful, so in simpler terms, this is just asking, how is climate change going to make life harder for the people and the systems that rely on fisheries? So to set the stage for this, and I know this is probably unnecessary background for the vast majority of this audience, but I like my fish diagram, so I'll do it anyway. In the broadest sense, climate change is altering the distributions of fish stocks around the world. So there are many ecological mechanisms through which this is happening, and there isn't necessarily a unidirectional shift that we can point to on a global scale. But there is generally consensus that climate is altering oceanic water temperatures, redistributing predator-prey dynamics, and just generally messing with the historic habitat ranges that fish and fisheries rely on. So again, in a very generalized sense, we have fish species moving out of their historic ranges. And in this figure, I show them moving poleward because that is a general trend that we see in many cases as the tropics and equatorial areas are warming at a rapid pace. So according to some modeling done by my colleague Giuliano Palacios Abrantes, about 78% of exclusive economic zones, or EEZs, will experience stock shifts by 2030. So this means that almost 80% of nations around the world will have to deal with stocks moving in or out of their waters by 2030. And since it's now 2024, that's a mere 6 years from now, which is very concerning. And this number is very significant for a number of reasons, including potential increased livelihood and food insecurity, governance challenges, and bureaucratic confusion in border zones. But also one of the implications of shifting stocks that's very interesting to me and is often overlooked in the literature is fisheries conflict. So this stat here is one that I always bring up when I talk about transboundary fisheries, and it's because it's quite staggering. So since the Cold War, about 25% of militarized interstate disputes have been fought over fish. So that means in the past 70 years or so, 1 in 4 multinational conflicts between democracies has involved fish or fisheries in some way. So when we think about the current geopolitical landscape and the prevalence of conflict and human rights abuses and all these other issues that we're already seeing, when we add onto that the growing threat of conflict over shifting fisheries under climate change, this becomes a very important area to understand and proactively prepare for in the future. So to address this massive problem that I just mentioned, my team at the Environmental Defense Fund planned a workshop in 2022 which then led to the formation of a working group, which then eventually led to the publication of this manuscript. So this paper basically lays out the problem of shifting stocks as it relates to conflict. And it does this by providing specific geographical case studies of places around the world where these issues are already materializing on the water. So I'll briefly go into some of the main takeaways of this paper, and then I'll transition to talking about oceans futures, which is one of the ways in which we're attempting to operationalize these findings and translate the science into the venues where it's most usable and can actually lead to different policies on the water. Okay, so now onto the findings of the paper itself. So the first thing we did when we started grappling with this issue of the connection between transboundary stocks and conflict was to think about the dynamics of transboundary fisheries themselves. And we decided to bucket the different types of potential stock shift into these 4 archetypes shown here. So there are several important delineations here that our research team postulated would have some bearing on the likelihood of conflict to emerge over shifting resources. So the first is denoted by these red and gray fish in the figure. It'll help if I put the labels. There we go. So red fish signify novel stock shifts, which just means a stock that has not been historically present in an area, but due to climate change, it's now entering territories or jurisdictions where it has not been present in the past. Alternatively, the gray fish, which you see in these bottom 2 figures on the left, these gray fish denote existing stocks, which means these stocks are also shifting across jurisdictional boundaries, but they've been present to a certain extent in the past. So there's probably some type of management structure or allocation system in place to deal with them. And the other component of this is these different dotted lines you see here, which basically just denote international boundaries. So our research team at the outset kind of postulated that the shifts between high seas and EEZs, so this top right and bottom left, we hypothesized that these types of shifts would be potentially more problematic for conflict formation. And there are a number of reasons that we thought this. Some of them just related to the jurisdictional complexity of governing the high seas. Others more related to lack of enforcement and monitoring in distant water areas. So there are a number of reasons why we thought this, and I'll talk very briefly about whether or not that played out in our case studies. But these other 2 types, the top left and bottom right, are shifts between EEZs, and these are also very important in terms of existing allocation policies, potential food security and livelihood security as stocks are moving out of one national jurisdiction and into another. So there are a lot of different concerns that arise with these different archetypes of stock shift, but within all of them, our goal was to analyze how the stock shift is directly related to potential conflict. So now that we have these archetypes of stock shift, our next step as the research team was to actually collect case studies. So we looked for places around the world where these archetypes or a version of these archetypes are actually playing out on the water. So we did this by leveraging the expertise of our workshop group of around 30 people, and we solicited examples of each of these archetypes and tried to get information on the systemic and governance factors that are leading to the formation or avoidance of conflict over these fish resources. So we ended up with these 4 case studies, each of which was written by a regional expert with deep experience working in each of these respective fisheries. So something that might jump out to you is the lack of case studies representing archetypes A and B from the last slide. So A and B were the ones involving novel stock shifts between both EEZs and the high seas and between EEZs. So in this paper, we discuss a number of explanations for this omission, the first of which simply being the limited scope of our 4 case studies. So 4 is not a very high sample size, obviously. So there's a potential that we just, due to sampling bias, didn't have a very comprehensive list of case studies. But there are also other potential factors like reporting bias or the mismatch between human perception and ecological realities. So omissions aside, we collected these 4 case studies, and then our task was to comparatively analyze them for common drivers or inhibitors of conflict relating to these shifting species. And in all these cases, the fish are moving across some international boundary, so either out of one country or into another country. And we didn't look for any case studies of intra-national shifts, even though those are also very important. So as a result of all those case studies, we came up with this general causal model of fishery conflict. So this model is very complex, and I don't expect anyone to fully digest it on a tiny screen, but it was created based on the 4 individual models that we made for each of the case studies that I just showed. So you can see this model is fairly generalized and doesn't provide too much specific guidance. So if you're interested in kind of seeing the dynamics of all of this and some examples, I will point you to the paper, which I've linked to at the end. But I do want to draw your attention to this component of the diagram, which is the initial response stage of a governance system. And this can be at any scale. So we don't really define at what scale we're talking about governance. But this initial response stage turned out to be really important in determining whether or not conflict forms or if conflict is avoided. So again, we have some specific examples of how this actually plays out on the water within the manuscript. But just pointing out that these 3 different overarching buckets of response, so non-cooperative, adaptive, or cooperative, which I can provide examples of during the Q&A if there's time. These just turned out to be very important explainers in how we arrive at fisheries conflict over transboundary resources. Okay, so now that I've gone over some of the context of this work and the academic backing that supports the connections between climate impacted fisheries and conflict, I want to move into just explaining this really amazing project I've been working on with the World Wildlife Fund, which is the Oceans Futures platform. So also the slides will change theme in this portion, so I apologize for the discontinuity. Okay, so Oceans Futures is an initiative being led by Sarah Glasser at the World Wildlife Fund. And this platform is attempting to predict future hotspots of ocean conflict under a changing climate, and to, as it says here, stop ocean conflict before it happens. So I was brought onto this project in 2022, and this was very driven as a follow-on to the previous research I was just discussing. And the first version of the platform actually just launched a few months ago in November. So this is a very exciting and timely practical application of this research. The goals of this platform are numerous, but first and foremost, it's a data-driven visualization and prediction tool. And through this tool, we're attempting to get the science on shifting stocks and other oceanic threats in front of the people who actually have decision-making ability to do something with that science. So looking to translate the science that we have that's often trapped in academic journals into a pretty online platform that's maybe more digestible and appealing to policymakers. The platform is still in its early stages, and we have plans to expand this work over the next few years. But in this current version, we visualized 20 global hotspots of future ocean conflict. So these hotspots were calculated via a hotspot indexing exercise, which was based on a number of variables that took months and months to determine. And they include variables such as seafood dependence of a nation, historical armed conflict, fish movement, stock status, and a few others. A full list of these variables and the methods through which we calculated the hotspots and the hotspots themselves are available on the Oceans Futures website. You can see in the bottom right where it says methodology, there's a lot of information there. And another component of the platform that I think is really interesting is we have this set of 3 spotlight regions that were developed by our research team. So there are 3 spotlights currently, which focus on places of particular concern for climate impacted fisheries conflict. So the 3 hotspots or spotlights are Ecuador, the Horn of Africa, and as I will briefly talk about next, the Arctic. So with my remaining few minutes, I want to briefly talk about the Arctic, both as a region of focus for the Oceans Futures platform, but also as a component of my ongoing research into emerging extraction and ocean conflict risk in this region. So the Arctic is a surprisingly opaque geography for many of us in the ocean space. So I want to start with a visual of what we're talking about here. So the reason I'm focusing some of my future work on this particular region is partially due to the extreme threats posed by climate change to the ecological and social fabric of this region. So this map here shows just a few of the competing definitions of the Arctic that are used by various international groups. And this isn't even taking into account the high seas area in the middle of the Arctic Ocean. So if you remember from about 10 minutes ago, our conflict research found that these EEZ to high seas stock shifts are more complex. So there's a lot to be concerned about in this region involving fisheries, the central region, and these varying definitions of how we jurisdictionally define the Arctic. As I mentioned earlier, the Arctic is featured on Oceans Futures as a spotlight region. And since I was responsible for this particular part of the site, I'll briefly show you what this looks like. So here what you're seeing is the projected change in fish biomass in the Arctic and near Arctic EEZs from 2020 to 2050. And as you can see, there's a lot of variation. And what's interesting is there are definitely some regions, I'm just going to click through this a few more times. There are some regions where biomass is increasing, but there are also regions like Alaska and Russia where total biomass is decreasing pretty substantially by 2050. Now, something to keep in mind about this data, which is also from Giuliano and William Chung at UBC, this data is showing total fishable biomass, so total biomass that can be consumed by humans. And we are not looking at individual species yet at this point. That's something that we might integrate in the future. But this at least makes the impending impacts of climate change pretty clear and kind of shows the different ways in which the Arctic will be changing just from an ecological sense. So if you're interested in diving into some of the other factors beyond just the ecological, on the Oceans Futures site, you can see on this dashboard on the right, we have a lot of really deep and rich information on each of the hotspots and spotlights, which sounds synonymous, but they're slightly different on the platform. But we have all of this information for all of them. And like I said, we're still in the process of improving the platform and integrating the predictive model components. But there is still a lot of information in here to go look at and to think through the different factors that can lead to conflict. Because if this isn't something you're thinking about every day, it can be kind of weird to think about how something like seafood dependence can be leading directly to conflict in some areas of the world. So I know I'm almost out of time if my clock is correct. So I just want to briefly plug a few events that are upcoming, which focus on these topics of transboundary fisheries and the Arctic. So the first is a World Fisheries Congress session in Seattle from March 6th to 7th. I'm co-convening this with some partners listed at the bottom here and being led by Katie Longo, who I think was on this call. And this session is focused on managing fisheries in a world of shifting stocks. So if any of you on this call will be at the World Fisheries Congress and want to hear more about this work that I've been discussing, then you can come see us then. And the second is the Arctic Science Summit Week, also in March in Edinburgh in the UK. So if you're interested in or working on Arctic issues relating to small-scale fisheries, indigenous groups, and blue carbon, then that will also be a virtual option event that you can tune into. So with that, I can take a few questions if we have time. And I put the 2 links to the projects that I mentioned here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jackie. Really interesting presentation. And we have about 5 minutes for questions. So if anyone has a question, feel free to raise your hand, unmute. You can also leave questions in the chat. I think there was already a question in the chat for you while people are brainstorming their questions, but feel free to unmute and ask your questions as well.
I'm reading the question in the chat. Yes, David, that's a very good question. So David's question is about if we've looked at long-time jurisdictional work around forestry, forest conflict, and deforestation. So when we first started this project, we brought in a few conflict experts, and they definitely recommended looking at the water space. So in the introduction to our paper, we briefly go into some of the analogous conflicts in the water resource space and how that can potentially inform fisheries conflict. We didn't look as much at deforestation and forest conflict. I have read a few papers here and there that talk about, for example, protected areas within forests and how that can maybe be applied to ocean spaces. And that's definitely something that we should look at in the future. So thank you for that question. That's a great point.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions for Jackie?
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you for this lesson. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for listening. And stop.
It looks like there's a question from Adrian in the chat about networks of stakeholders, whether you maintain an active network of stakeholders on changes in species distribution and or the risks of conflict.
It's a good question. So since I did this work when I was still working at EDF, the Environmental Defense Fund definitely has a big network of on-the-ground people who are more involved in this, and I definitely drew on that during this work. Otherwise, we don't have a specific network of stakeholders, especially since, as I said, each of the case studies was written by a regional expert. So I was not the one who was actually looking deeply into these communities and writing case studies. We were relying on people who were already ingrained within those systems to write them. So if you are interested in a network, I can find those contacts through my spiderweb network. But yes, I do not currently have like a list of that.
Can I add to that real quick? That certainly is part of the Fish Corps program. We hope to be building that kind of network. And so, Adrian, if you're interested in connecting more on that and having the Fish Corps coordination folks connect you with some other folks working on that, we're happy to help. So you can follow up with me. I'll put my email in the chat.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. That's a good point.
Hi, can I come in with a question?
Absolutely.
Hi, this is Manuel from the European Union delegation to the US here in DC. Thank you very much for the presentation, Jackie. It's an eye-opener, certainly. And I was wondering if the Oceans Futures platform has used data from Copernicus, you know, the new project. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I didn't get if we've used data from what?
From Copernicus?
No,
Doesn't ring a bell. Okay.
I don't think so. Yeah, I don't think so.
Copernicus is basically a project of the EU gathering remote sensing, you know, from land-based and air-based, underwater-based systems, and the data is available for free for the scientists to use. So I was wondering if you hadn't used it. That's really not. So that's fine. Thanks.
Well, we are still updating the predictive model and creating it. So maybe I will follow up with you to hear more about that, because that could be a very good addition. So thanks.
Okay, absolutely. Yeah. I'll write my email in the chat.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Perfect. And we have time for maybe one more question before we turn to Melissa's presentation. If there are any other questions, also we'll have some time after Melissa's presentation as well for questions for both presenters. So feel free to also drop questions in the chat if you have additional ones. Hearing none, perhaps we shift to Melissa's presentation. I've already introduced Melissa, and as a reminder, she'll be presenting on the Distribution Mapping and Analysis Portal, DISMAP project. And Melissa, we're looking forward to hearing about that work.
Awesome, thank you. You can see my screen, everyone?
Yep.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks everyone for having me present today. I'm going to be talking about this mapping portal that we released actually last year. So it's just reached about a year and a half old, I guess. So with that, sorry, my screen's not changing. Don't know why. Sorry, now
No,
it's
okay.
frozen. Okay.
There you go.
Yeah. So we've already kind of heard, I'm sure everyone here is really familiar, the ocean is rapidly changing. We're seeing warming oceans, ocean acidification, rising sea levels, and loss of sea ice. And all of that is having large impacts on our species redistribution or species distributions as they're kind of responding to changing ocean conditions. And several papers have, estimated that between 25 to 85% of marine species have already experienced a shift in part of their geographical range. And our model predictions are predicting that these shifts are going to be continuing into the future. And these species redistributions are having consequences for fishing communities, um, ecosystem services, and are leading to the jurisdictional conflicts that we just heard about from Jackie. So this leads to there being this really high demand for species information that can be used for fishery decision making and other ocean use decision making. And we kind of thought to ourselves, well, how can we really improve access and delivery of this information to our end users and stakeholders? How can we kind of get distribution modeling and species distribution data kind of out of these publications and reports and into a more user-friendly, dynamic, accessible, and usable platform? So that led us to develop this distribution mapping analysis portal. And this effort also really kind of stemmed out of previous work between NOAA and Milan Pinsky's lab at Rutgers working on Ocean Adapt. And we kind of took that previous effort and we're kind of bringing into a next generational interactive platform. So we developed DISMAP to provide this online portal for visualizing and analyzing distribution data, allowing users to view, download, and dynamically interact with this data, to look at changes in distributions for over 400 marine fish and invertebrate species. And our main mission with this portal is to improve that ease of access to and exploration of species distribution data, to support decision makers to use the spatial data to inform decisions such as spatial closures, marine protected areas, allocations, as well as stock boundaries and survey designs for use in stock assessments. We also were hoping that this portal could foster sharing and exchange of practices and ideas among scientists working on species distribution modeling. So for this first version of the portal, the current version up online, we are providing information from fishery independent data sets for 9 regions in the US. So these regions are Eastern Bering Sea, Northern Bering Sea, Aleutian Islands, and Gulf of Alaska and Alaska. We have the Deep 7 data set for Hawaii. So they're the only non-bottom trawl survey we have currently. The West Coast Triennial and Annual Bottom Trawl Survey, Gulf of Mexico, the Southeast Bottom Trawl Survey, Spring, Summer, and Fall, and the Northeast Spring and Fall Bottom Trawl. So for our processing of this data, we took those 9 data sets and we passed it through a R script that, again, was previously developed with the Ocean Adapt team at Rutgers. And this code compiles all the kind of raw survey data tables from the different surveys, compiles it into a standardized format and data structure. So we've standardized all the column names and the units across all the regions. And then we take that data set and we evaluate the survey coverage for those data sets to ensure that there's a consistent spatial footprint across time. So for instance, in this figure here, it shows strata and coverage kind of by year, and then it also shows it spatially. And you can see there is a large, for the Gulf of Mexico, this large gap in terms of the strata where they weren't sampling the whole eastern half of the Gulf of Mexico before 2008. So we kind of look at these types of graphs and make decisions on whether or not we are going to remove strata or remove entire chunks of years where there wasn't a consistent sampling. And in this case, for Gulf of Mexico, we decided to remove all the survey years before 2008 so we can have a nice coverage of the entire Gulf of Mexico in this case. We also then trim the data sets to only include species that are caught in more than 5% of tows in more than 3/4 of the year. So that way, again, we're looking for information on distribution shifts. So we are trying to ensure that we're getting species that are being adequately sampled by these trawl surveys. And that leads us to over 400 species. And our final process data includes a region, a haul ID, a year, the lat long, stratum depth, some area depth, the species, and then our unit that we're kind of mapping is that weight catch per unit effort. We then take this standardized data set and we push it through an interpolated biomass processing. So we're using inverse distance weighting for our interpolation method with a cube-grit transform. We have spatial weighting parameters shown there, and we also include a temporal weighting of a 5-year kind of moving window, so that is kind of smoothing out some of that interannual variability that you might see. So we're not seeing these like large spikes in the change. Our pixel size, we're then projecting it onto 2-kilometer pixel cell size. And these interpolation boundaries, which in this example for black sea bass in the Northeast is shown in red. So that's kind of the boundary of the survey footprint, and that's the extent of our interpolation. We don't interpolate beyond where we've gone sampling. We then use those distribution maps to calculate several range shift parameters. So we have our center of gravity range shift, which is otherwise the centroid or center of biomass, and that's that central location of the population calculated as a biomass weighted average location. So you kind of take each latitude, multiply it by its weight CPUE, sum that up, and then kind of average across the weight CPUE. So you're getting that biomass weighted average latitude. And that's shown in the red line on this graph. And then we have range limits, which are the kind of boundaries of the stock, kind of the leading and trailing edges. So our leading edge is that top kind of poleward edge, northward in our case. That is the 95% kind of maximum latitude. And then the trailing edge, which is that southern poleward or equator-wise boundary, and that's that 5% minimum latitude. We also then calculate regional summaries, so kind of averaging change in latitude across, or average change in latitude and depth across a core set of species. So you can kind of get an idea of, on average, how are species moving in certain regions compared to others. So that now just kind of go through a little bit about what this looks like on the portal. So we've taken all that information and we've put it onto this mapping portal. So this is kind of the homepage that you'll see if you visit the site. It runs through kind of what the different modules are. We have links to our technical document that also run through all this processing that I just talked about, as well as metadata. And actually, this is a slightly outdated version. There's a newer version too that also has a link to our GitHub page with the code. So on the portal, you have kind of this ability to look at single species distribution shifts. So you select your species, region, and season of interest if there's multiple seasons. And you'll be able to see this time series graph on the side panel that's showing you that center of gravity shift through time and those range limits. So you can kind of see if the species is moving north or south, and if its range limits are expanding or contracting through time. And then on the map, you'll see, again, that distribution, the interpolated biomass distribution map, and you'll be able to play a animation. So you can click play and you can see that distribution changing through time. And then the points shown there are the kind of the survey catch information that you can kind of see what the raw, more raw data looks like relative to the interpolated biomass. We also have a function on the single species analysis module where you can draw an area of interest. You can sketch out an area of interest, and the portal will calculate the percent of that area that is occupied by that species distribution, and also the proportion of the species total kind of predicted biomass from that interpolation that's found within that area. So this kind of allows you to, if you're a manager, to understand kind of how the species is shifting relative to potentially a management area of interest or a fishing area of interest. And this is the, we have that regional summary page as well, as I mentioned. So this is where you can go to look at kind of changes across species within a region, to kind of see on average how they're shifting latitude and depth. And then the map on the page here shows the kind of species richness and how that changes through time. And that's just by stacking up the interpolated biomass layers for those core sets of species and counting number of species present in each pixel. So just kind of to give some an idea of some of the results you can get from looking at this portal. So for instance, those regional trends, most regions we're seeing northward, poleward trends, which, in line with what we're generally seeing in the ocean. However, the Gulf of Mexico is a notable example of, or exception to that, where we're actually seeing, it saw some northward shifts at the beginning, and now we're actually seeing some southward shifts in latitude in more recent years, and that largely could due to the fact that the way that the geography of the Gulf of Mexico species can't really move north because of a land barrier, so they're kind of moving south. Versus the Northeast, you're seeing a very clear and pretty consistent northward shift in distribution. For depth is a little bit more kind of inconsistent across the regions. Most seem to be moving slightly deeper, but we do have regions like the Gulf of Alaska and the Southeast and the West Coast where you're actually seeing species moving slightly shallower through time. But again, it's kind of an inconsistent, no real trends. But then you have in the Northeast, for instance, you're seeing a very consistent trend to deeper waters in the Northeast. And then just kind of looking across the regions here, this is just a summary table showing kind of the number of species moving north versus south by region. And, we can see the majority of the species, we have about 400 species that were moving north. So again, it's species by region, so that's why it's more than the 400 species we have. But and then there's about only 229 that we're seeing a southward shift. And then the regions of the greatest kind of proportional shifts north, you have like Eastern Bering Sea, Northeast, both in the spring and the fall, and in the West Coast, where over 70% of their species in that that data set are moving northward. And then just looking at kind of individual species trends. So again, you can look at specific species of interest to understand their distribution shifts. And here's an example of a black sea bass where you're really seeing that northward shift along the east coast of the United States, where we have, this picture here showing 1974 for black sea bass, and it was the highest kind of concentration of biomass was down in that kind of offshore in that bright greenish area, greenish blue area near Massachusetts, Delaware, or not Massachusetts, sorry, Maryland and Virginia and Delaware. And then by 2022, that hotspots kind of moved northward and now kind of off of New Jersey and Long Island. And you're often now seeing it into the Gulf of Maine. So we also have some plans moving forward. Again, this portal, it's still obviously a work in progress and constantly trying to evolve it to meet user needs. So for this year, we're planning to add a Polygon upload and download capability for that area analysis function, so that instead of having to draw an area, you could potentially upload your own shapefile. So you could explore other areas of interest that maybe we don't have available, but you could upload that to the portal and run the analysis with that. And we also want to start bringing in climate and environmental linked SDMs, both hindcasts and forecasts moving forward. Example I show here from Kathy Mills and Andrew Allen's work from the Goffman Research Institute, and trying to find ways to bring that sort of model outputs and collaborate with those such partners to bring in those type of model outputs onto the portal, so that users can not only try to understand kind of observe changes in distribution through historical period, but also thinking about looking to see what that might mean in the future as well. And then for brainstorming for future years, as I mentioned, we only have those 9 regions and data sets, primarily bottom trawl survey. And we're looking to see if we can bring in additional types of data sets and providing these interpolated biomass layers for those. So, highly migratory species, maybe looking at the Southeast fishery independent survey data, hook and line surveys, other types of survey data beyond the bottom trawl. And then also potentially developing some additional types of indicators beyond just center of gravity, depth and latitude that could potentially also help understanding distribution shifts and the impacts of those shifts. And with that, I just want to recognize the team of people that were involved in building this portal. We have our development team who are in charge of building the nuts and bolts of the back end capabilities and front end capabilities of the portal. And then we have our expert kind of working group that were kind of behind brainstorming what information and what visualizations and how we want the portal to look. So just want to acknowledge that team. And then I invite you all to, please get exploring on the portal. You can scan the QR code here. I will note that it doesn't work great on phones, but you can also visit the site following the link here. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Thanks so much for presenting about DISMAP. And I see that there's one question in the chat, and we also have time for other questions about this project and sort of curious to hear what questions folks have.
Sorry, I'm trying to read the question on the chat. Okay, just wondering if anyone on the team, wait, I don't know, that's for me, or if that's a general question.
It may be a general question as well, in case other folks have been working on those types of studies.
Okay, yeah.
There looks to be a question in the chat from Libby Jewett about if there's any talk of expanding the data in DISMAP beyond the bottom trawl data or to other surveys that NOAA does.
Yes, thanks for that question. Yes, so we piloted that, like the ability to be able to do that by working with the Bottom Fish Survey in Hawaii, which is a non-bottom trawl survey. It's a cooperative, I think, hook and line and camera survey. And we were able to generate the distribution, interpolated biomass distribution layers with that data set. So it was promising, and we're now thinking, what other types of data sets like that can we pull in and we can develop those types of products for. So I think the most kind of likely next target for that would be something in the Caribbean or the Southeast Atlantic, mainly thinking about regions that we don't have great spatial coverage for right now. Like we don't have any Caribbean data sets. And the Southeast trawl is a very narrow band along the South Atlantic. So the thinking of expanding it to further on the shelf we would have to bring in some of those other data sets. So yes, we don't want to expand it to like every single survey that's out there necessarily, but ones that we think provide enough spatial coverage to give distribution shift information. And that might be sampling key kind of management targeted species is something that we do definitely want to explore, trying to bring those in. I will also note that another way we might be able to get information for those types of species is through bringing in this distribution model. So that way, if we don't have the survey data and the interpolated biomass version of that distribution, if we're able to bring in a distribution model, then I think that's another way to get at those types of species and distribution data as well.
Were there any other questions? We can also open up the floor for questions for either presenter, for both of our presenters or generally about shifting species distributions too. Hearing none, perhaps we can kind of do a wrap up of the webinar itself, and you know, if any folks have follow-up questions, I think emails might have been dropped in the chat. I see a number of emails in the chat of folks that are going to follow up after this conversation. But thank you everyone for joining our webinar. Thank you to both Jackie and Melissa for presenting your work. It was really exciting to hear about sort of different ways, different types of projects around shifting species distribution. So hopefully folks were able to find some inspiration from those projects as well. Our next webinar, our February webinar, will be Thursday, February 29th. More information about that webinar will be sent out in the next few weeks, and a recording of this webinar will be available online as well. So if you want to rewatch the presentations or share with anyone else in your networks that you think might be interested, feel free to do so. But otherwise, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks everyone for joining.